Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
A few years back, I made a video where I compared Mel Gibson's 2004 film The Passion of the Christ to Martin Scorsese's 1987 film The Last Temptation of Christ. This video has, I think, over 1,000 views, and I still get comments on it to this day. It's easily one of my most watched and most controversial videos. Recently, I got into a little back and forth with a viewer about the film. Our comments back and forth to each other proceeded as follows. The Last Temptation of Christ is blasphemous. It shows Jesus having sex, nudity. They added many parts like Jesus removing his gerst. I believe the viewer meant to say heart. Not sure if you actually saw the movie, but the point of Jesus getting with Mary Magdalene was that it was sort of an elongated dream sequence where he listens to Satan instead of God, and ultimately gives into temptation, only for the movie to then show you the canon ending after showing that Jesus resisted temptation in actuality. It just shows what would have happened if he didn't. Yes, that's still blasphemy. Why would Jesus listen to Satan? He didn't. He couldn't. So still blasphemous. Passion of the Christ is mostly accurate. It's not blasphemous to talk about what Jesus may have done if he listened. The movie still adheres to the canon. They just took the time to show what was at stake and what may have become of Jesus if he did not complete his mission. I wouldn't call that blasphemy. I'd call that a greater, more thorough retelling of the great and beautiful story of the crucifixion. No, if Jesus was with you, would you watch it? Would he sit and entertain a film about him having sex and many other things by portraying those we bring God down to human level and weakness? To answer your first question, I would 100% watch this with him. I would find it to be intellectually and spiritually stimulating to ask him about his experiences there from a first-person perspective and with a theological lens. Second, Jesus was 100% man and 100% God. To deny his ability to even consider sinning would go against the canon, as he was tempted according to the Gospels. The film does not say this should have happened, or even take a neutral stance on if it did happen. It doesn't bring Jesus down to our level. It in fact states the opposite of how he was able to resist and avoid what was shown in that sequence because of his divine nature. This film is an explanation as to why we needed Jesus in the first place, because the reality of Jesus giving into his 100% human side of his 200% being would be a horrible existence not only for him, but for the rest of the world, and acknowledging this adds greater weight to the story of his triumph against evil. This was the end of our interaction. Now, I'm not going to spend this video talking about the comments of this specific user. My stance on what he said was pretty clear. What I wanted to discuss is how this highlights a bigger issue that I've come across when it comes to this film in religious circles that I've been associated with. Full disclosure, I would identify as a man of faith. I love film, I love philosophy, I love theology. I love looking at films and media that challenge me in my beliefs and philosophies. I love exploring how other people think about things like the Bible, consciousness, and the meaning of life, if there is any at all. Now, I would consider myself in the minority, however, in the community of Christians that I was raised with my whole life. I've noticed over the years that there have been plenty of instances of a purity problem when it comes to expressing ideas and thoughts outside of the norm. Now, that may not be new for American Christianity. There's a long history of intolerance in the church, and that's partially by dogma and partially by an invention of many church leaders to protect and shield their followers from having their minds tainted with the idea of thinking for themselves, usually. However, when it comes to films I've seen most discussed as overtly awful by Christians I've been associated with, I found myself very perplexed. These films being the aforementioned 1987 masterpiece, The Last Temptation of Christ, and William Friedkin's 1973 masterpiece, The Exorcist. Personally, I have a deep love for both of these films, not just because they are both masterful technical pieces of filmmaking by some of the greatest filmmakers to ever pick up a camera, but because they are both great stories that explore Christian theology in different ways. And while there's rather extreme imagery in both films, from Jesus pulling out his own heart in the temptation to many insane antics of the demon of the exorcist, both of these films have a very pro-Christian message. both are strong condemnations of evil. They both have stories with redemptive arcs that show the sacrifice a person is willing to make to preserve innocent and even guilty life, because that's the right thing to do. These are concepts that, in my mind, Christians should not only embrace but celebrate when films are willing to go that far and not just take on the nihilistic apathy that we see so often day to day in the world that we live in. But when it comes to the circles that I've been acquainted with, anything that presents images or complex concepts that may not be exactly wholesome or acknowledge very basic things like the fact Jesus was still a human being with human being urges as blasphemous and as going against the faith, the lack of openness to even their own concepts presented in a way that are not familiar frightens them, often equated with the devil or something demonic, even though the very denial of something like that is the very definition of blasphemy. But these attacks are disingenuous at best and ultimately irresponsible and contradictory. The Bible is a book filled with unwholesome stories and concepts, everything from incest to war, rape to murder, and also filled with deep philosophical and theological quandaries. The book of Job, for instance, the story of a man whose faith in God is tested by having his entire world ripped from him. This myth attempts to present an answer to the idea that there is an all-powerful God in a world where evil also exists. Two completely contradictory things that seemingly can't exist together. But it does. The problem of evil is something that many faithful struggle with. But that's the entire point, isn't it? Faith can't exist unless there is doubt connected to it. Faith and doubt walk hand in hand. It's understandable that there is a want to recoil and shield yourself from things that may challenge your beliefs. However, when it comes to the films I mentioned before, they not only provide a challenge, they present the solution being the very faith itself. And my question is, why is there such a recoiling when it comes to the works that still come to the conclusion that the very people who criticize it have come to as well? In part, I think there's a deep insecurity of their faith and a lack of understanding when it comes to these films. Many of those who act the most fanatical and go out of their way to discredit and destroy art like this ultimately seems to be using their faith or any belief system as a crutch for their own identity, which they are insecure about. This is a belief system that they have bought into, but are not necessarily acquainted with it deeply. They just know it gives them meaning, and that they are then scared of anything that would seem to challenge the strict confines of the box that they've put themselves in order to feel secure, when the reality of the situation is they end up eating their own. You are not pure enough to be a part of this, or claim to have anything to do with this belief, and therefore you are invalid. But if this is how you act when someone doesn't adhere to your strict ideas on how to believe, then you are no better and no more righteous than the religious authorities that Jesus sought to overthrow and delegitimize in his mission here on earth, which ultimately ended in his death on the cross. At the end of the day, while I may respond to those comments because I feel like it's interesting to have a thoughtful discussion with viewers who have different viewpoints on the films that I talk about, ultimately the point of a discussion is to come into it with an open mind. Because without an open mind, you're not discussing anything. You're fighting. You are only pushing back. All of my favorite films have always had to do with a discussion. Discussing the issues at hand, discussing the moral, philosophical, theological quandaries that we find ourselves in today, the things that make us scratch our heads, the things that we cannot quite put our finger on as to how they could have happened. What is the right thing to do? And why should we do it? Is there even a reason to? Films like The Last Temptation of Christ brilliantly and beautifully exemplify this idea of making faith not just a strict doctrine that you adhere to, but a dialogue in it of itself.